When James Stevens handed money to a homeless man, he didn't expect it would lead him to an inheritance buried under decades of betrayal and pain. Secret riches, racism, and social injustice collided, forcing James to make decisions that would change everything. What happened next surprised even the most worldly individuals. But let's start from the beginning. James Stevens was the man everyone dreamed of being. Wealthy, influential, and successful. His name was known on Wall Street, his face on the covers of business magazines, and his parties were the talk of society. He lived in a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of New York, where tall fences concealed his life from the rest of the world. On the surface, everything looked perfect. Business meetings with investors, expensive dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, and regular trips along the coast on his private yacht. Yet, despite his outward success, James increasingly felt an emptiness inside. He wondered if his life had any true meaning, and what his wealth was contributing to the world beyond his own pleasures. One evening, sitting in his vast office with a view of the New York skyline, James once again drifted into deep thought. His bank account was full, but something crucial was missing from his life. Years of successful deals and accumulating wealth left him with the feeling that all he was doing was collecting material possessions, without contributing anything significant to others. Then, a thought hit him, one that instantly shocked him. What if I help someone who truly needs it? Do something meaningful. The next day, James decided to put his idea into action. Instead of attending another meeting with business partners, he drove to one of the poorest areas of the city, a place he had never been before. Driving his expensive car down narrow streets littered with trash and crumbling buildings. The contrast with his usual world was overwhelming. People dressed in old, torn clothes wandered the streets with empty eyes. Among them, James noticed a man sitting by an abandoned house, holding a cardboard cup for spare change. His face was gaunt, his clothes so worn they could hardly provide warmth on that chilly day. James stopped his car and got out. That man, as he later found out, was John, a homeless person who had spent the last 10 years on the streets. John was used to people avoiding eye contact and hurrying past him, fearful of even the slightest interaction. He certainly didn't expect someone like James, a clean-cut, confident, and obviously successful man, to approach him. "Hello," James said, sitting down beside John on the cold sidewalk. "I want to help you." At first, John said nothing, staring intently at the stranger, trying to figure out what was happening. He had seen people like this before, people who promised help but never followed through. "I don't need promises," John muttered quietly, trying to avoid looking James in the eye. But James did something unexpected. He pulled out his checkbook and, without saying much, wrote his last check for a large sum. It was so large, in fact, that John couldn't even imagine such an amount. "Take it," James said, handing him the check. "This will help you start a new life." John stared at the piece of paper in his hand, dumbfounded. He couldn't believe someone was actually willing to give him such a huge sum of money for free. "Why?" was the only word spinning in his head. "I don't know what to say," John finally mumbled. "Why are you doing this?" James smiled. Even he didn't fully understand what had driven him to this act. But he knew one thing. It felt right. "Just believe me, this is more than just money. It's a chance," James said. "Use it wisely." They exchanged a brief glance filled with understanding, and James left, feeling an incredible lightness. For the first time in years, he felt like he had done something real. Not for fame or profit, but simply because he wanted to do good. As he sat in his car and drove away, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction wash over him. He didn't know what would happen to John next, but he knew one thing. This random act of kindness had changed not only the homeless man's life, but his own as well. Several months passed since James Stevens had made his generous gesture, donating a large sum to a homeless man. Life slowly returned to its normal routine. More meetings with business partners, yacht trips, and social events. Yet, despite his outward success, James often thought about that moment. He couldn't fully explain why it had been so meaningful to him. But something inside him had changed. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly useful. One day, On a regular afternoon, James came home after a business meeting. As he opened his mailbox, he noticed among the many letters one with an official seal. Paying it little attention, he tossed it onto the table and continued with his day. But later that evening, over a glass of wine, curiosity got the better of him, and he opened the envelope. The letter was from a lawyer, containing an astonishing message. James had been invited to the reading of a will. But whose? He wondered. The name of the deceased meant nothing to him. John Davis. It must be some kind of mistake, James thought, as he didn't know anyone by that name, let alone someone who would leave him an inheritance. However, his intrigue and curiosity wouldn't let him rest. He decided to go to the law office the next day to clear up the mystery. On the day of the will reading, James felt slightly uneasy as he walked into the attorney's office. He was greeted by a middle-aged lawyer with a serious expression. A few other people had already gathered in the room, all sitting quietly and reservedly. Once James took his seat, the lawyer quickly got down to business. "Good afternoon, Mr. Stevens," the lawyer began. "We are gathered here today to read the last will and testament of John Davis." The name hit James like a thunderbolt. John Davis. That was the same homeless man he had once given money to. James sat stunned, not understanding how this man could leave anything to him. After all, John was a destitute man living on the streets. "This must be some mistake," James said quietly, interrupting the lawyer. "I barely knew this man. How could he have left me anything?" The lawyer looked at him with understanding, as if he had expected this reaction. "No, Mr. Stevens, there is no mistake. John Davis indeed mentioned you in his will, and what he left you is a significant inheritance." James felt his hands go cold. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could a man who lived on the streets leave a significant inheritance? Was his whole life a mystery, hidden behind tattered clothes and a weary face? Curiosity and unease began to consume him. He drifted into his thoughts, trying to recall details from his encounter with John. James remembered giving him the check, hoping it would help him start a new life. But what had happened since then? Where had John been all these months, and how could he have owned something of value? "John had more than you could have imagined," the lawyer continued, seeing that James was clearly confused. "He wasn't just an ordinary homeless man. In the past, he owned many assets, but due to tragic circumstances, he lost almost everything. Nevertheless, he always believed that his encounter with you changed his life, which is why in his will, he left you everything he had left." James was speechless. He sat there unable to say a word as the lawyer continued to read out the details of the will. John Davis, who had seemed like just another poor man, had hidden assets, including real estate and shares in major companies. James realized that his random act of kindness had left a deeper impact than he could have ever imagined. Now, James had to decide what to do with this unexpected gift from fate. As James began to unravel the inheritance John had left him, the truth about this mysterious man's past gradually came to light. It turned out that John Davis, who at first glance seemed like just another homeless man in New York, actually had an astonishing past. He hadn't always lived on the streets. John was once one of the most influential real estate moguls in the city, owning an impressive portfolio of luxury properties in Manhattan. John's story was full of dramatic highs and devastating lows. He inherited his fortune from his father, who had been a pioneer in New York's construction business. The Davis family owned dozens of buildings across the city, from prestigious office complexes to historic residential properties. John grew up in an atmosphere of luxury, and from an early age, it was instilled in him that his life would always be surrounded by wealth and success. However, the business world turned out to be far harsher than John had anticipated. When he took over managing the real estate empire, he quickly learned that at the top of success, betrayal was often lurking behind those he trusted. His longtime business partners, whom he had worked with for years, conspired against him, seeking to take control of his assets. In a single moment, John lost everything: his buildings, his reputation, his friends, and with that, the meaning of life itself. The scandal was loud and public. The press relished the fall of the once mighty magnate. Devastated by the betrayal, John withdrew from everything. Unwilling to fight for the remaining scraps of his fortune, he chose to disappear. Instead of battling for what was left, he walked away, leaving behind any attempts to rebuild his empire. He became homeless by choice, living in the abandoned corners of the city, far from the prying eyes and former luxury. But even when John found himself at rock bottom, a warmth remained inside him, a flicker that no one could extinguish. Despite the betrayal and disappointment, he continued to believe that there was still room for kindness and compassion in the world. However, years on the street had made him cynical. He saw people walk past without even noticing him, and over time, he began to think that no one was capable of true kindness. It was in this state that he met James. When James stopped and offered help, John was stunned. At first glance, James seemed like everyone else, a rich, successful man who lived in his own world, blind to the realities beyond his mansion walls. But what James did was different. He didn't just toss money on the ground like some of those who wanted to buy off their guilt. He stopped, spoke, and respectfully extended a hand to help. This wasn't charity. It was a genuine act of empathy. This moment became a turning point for John. He began to think, maybe his past had been full of betrayal, but the world wasn't completely lost. If even one person was capable of kindness, then perhaps all hope was not gone. John started to remember what he still had left from his former life. Despite the collapse of his business, he still had assets that no one knew about. These were buildings he had inherited from his grandfather, properties he had always kept secret from his business partners. These buildings weren't listed in official records and were known only to him. Realizing that he would never return to his old life, John decided that the person who had helped him in his darkest moment deserved this fortune the most. He saw in James someone who, despite his wealth, remained human. Deciding that James needed to know the truth and receive these assets, John drafted a will in which he passed on the keys to his hidden buildings and investments to James. As James read the will and learned the truth about John's past, he was filled with an odd sense of wonder. How could someone who seemed to have lost everything still hold on to hope? He realized that his random act of kindness had set off an incredible chain of events. James was astonished to discover that his gesture had had such a profound impact on John, and now he was the owner of something he never could have imagined. The will not only passed on the physical keys to the real estate, but also became a symbol of the trust that John had placed in James. John believed that James would manage his hidden fortune in a way that no one else could. James Stevens sat in his enormous mansion, holding the documents that confirmed his right to the sudden inheritance. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much more complex and profound. Now, James was faced with a choice: how to manage the estate that John had left him. The inheritance, tied to betrayal and pain from the past, weighed heavily on his conscience with each passing thought. He could simply sell everything and add the money to his already substantial fortune, but something inside him resisted. These buildings and assets weren't just another good business deal. Behind them was an entire life, a life of a man James barely knew, but whose story deeply moved him. With each day, James found himself thinking more about the meaning of wealth and its true value. He could no longer look at money as just material wealth, as he once had. A few days passed before James made a final decision that he had to take a different approach. He realized that all this wealth, which had so easily fallen into his life, carried with it not just financial power, but the power to create change. But the change couldn't be about personal enrichment. It had to be something bigger. John hadn't just left him assets. He had left him a chance to make the world a better place, at least for those who, like John, had found themselves in desperate circumstances. After much thought and consultation, James decided the best way to honor John's memory and complex life was to establish a foundation. This foundation would help the homeless, those who, like John, had ended up on the streets after losing everything due to forces beyond their control. The John Davis Foundation would be not just a charity, but a real home for those searching for a second chance. The process of creating the foundation wasn't quick or easy. James poured all his resources, connections, and efforts into making it a reality. He started by restoring the buildings John had left him. These once hidden and neglected properties were now to become shelters, rehabilitation centers, and places where people could start their lives anew. James approached each project personally because, for him, this wasn't just a financial endeavor, it was a mission. Each day, as he saw the homeless on New York streets, James thought of John. He wondered how many people like John hid stories of pain and loss behind their desperate circumstances. How many of them could return to a normal life if someone just extended a helping hand, as he had once done for John? This question only deepened his resolve to make the foundation a success. In time, the John Davis Foundation became well known not just in New York, but beyond. It didn't just provide temporary housing. It supported job training programs, psychiatric and medical assistance, and social services. People who came through the foundation received a real opportunity to start over, and James felt that he had finally found his true calling. Looking back, James realized that his random act of generosity had changed not only John's life, but his own as well. What he had thought was a simple gesture turned out to be a pivotal moment that made him reevaluate his values and change his outlook on life and wealth. The money he once gave away so easily and thoughtlessly now had a new meaning, not as a tool for luxury, but as an instrument for good. James no longer saw his wealth as an end in itself. It had become, for him, a means to change lives, to help those at the bottom. Each new success of the foundation brought him a sense of fulfillment that he had never felt before, even during his financial peak. He now understood that true wealth wasn't measured by the numbers in a bank account, but by how much good one could do for others. Thus, John Davis's legacy became not just a symbol of faith and hope, but also a reminder to James that there is always room for compassion and humanity in the world. James understood that life is much more than the accumulation of material goods, and his new path was to help others find their second chance at a better future.